I'm Ben Mailing. I'm a patent attorney at EIP, and I have a background in applied maths. And I specialize in protecting computer implemented inventions, and in particular, inventions involving AI. I also lead a multidisciplinary team of lawyers at EIP that we call Codify, the logo in the corner there. And we kind of provide holistic IP advice and support around software, data, AI, and all those kind of things. So I'd like to start with a quick explanation or maybe a reminder of what intellectual property IP is. So IP has historically been used to refer to any original creation of human intellect, and IP rights provide a person or a company with the sort of legal remedies to prevent others from using those creations for a certain amount of time. So a patent is an IP right that allows you to stop others using an invention. Copyright's an IP right that allows you to stop people using an original creative work. Trademark's an IP right that can be used to stop others from using an indicator of origin of a product or a service or something like that. There's a pretty long history of policy and theory on why IP rights exist, but largely speaking, they're to prevent unfair economic activity. So, for example, unfairly benefiting from another party's investment in time or money. And in that way, IP rights are supposed to incentivize creative human endeavors. So I'd like to kind of you to keep that in mind throughout this talk. Now, the relationship with AI, the relationship between AI, in particular generative AI, and IP is quite complicated. So to best understand it, we need a suitable tool for the job, and it's not an LLM, but it is a neural network. And it's not just any neural network. It's actually the state of the art in explainable AI, because as you can see, every neuron is labeled. Just going to quickly go through it with you. The inputs of the network are the kind of objects we're primarily interested in, data and algorithms. In the case of a generative AI system, data might include data used to train a model, might be data that's fed to the system during inference. Similarly, algorithms could be training algorithms, inference algorithms, including any models that they call. The next layer represents features of those data and algorithms. So data might include public data, for example, scraped from the internet, personal data relating to identifiable individuals. It may include proprietary data that you've generated or collected yourself. And algorithms may also be proprietary, as in owned by you. They can be open, as in open source or open weights, and they can be closed, for example, hosted in a cloud and accessible by an API. The next layer is the legal layer, and this is where the kind of action really happens from my point of view. It includes various legal considerations relevant to the data and algorithms before. So for today's purpose, it includes IP rights, so that's things like patents, trade secrets, copyright, regulations, things like the GDPR, the forthcoming AI Act, agreements, in particular commercial agreements involving IP and IP strategy. And finally, we have the outputs of the neural network, and these represent possible outcomes for businesses. So the red ones represent generally unfavorable outcomes, things like litigation, reputational damage, regulatory penalties, loss of IP, and all of the positive outcomes I've put in one node, winning, whatever that looks like for a business. And my task is kind of to optimize this to, in particular, what happens in the legal layer to give the highest probability of ending up at winning. And the fun part is that different paths through this network represent different issues encountered in the context of AI, and in particular generative AI. So today I'm going to talk through a few of these. And the first thing I'm going to talk about is a highly controversial topic, and that is whether it's legal to train an AI model, a generative AI model, on any and all data scraped from a public source like the internet. Now, some of you may already have strong views on whether the answer should be yes or no on this. And from what I see on my LinkedIn feed, at least, it's actually a pretty polarizing topic. So I'll try and be quite balanced. But the issue is that much of the content on the internet, whether it's text, audio, video, or images, are original works, and they're covered by copyright, even if they are publicly available for viewing. And that's the case whether or not there's a paywall in place. And copyright enables rights holders to sue anyone for copying or making adaptations or derivative works. Um, Now, there are arguments that training a generative AI model makes copies, whether it's either temporarily during the training process or the scraping, whether the learning of the weights themselves during training is actually something like copying or making a derivative work. And along the way, that work is stripped of any attribution information and other things that you would have to usually supply if you're using a copyright work. But then on the other hand, some people say that training an AI model is analogous to kind of a human learning from something they've read on the internet, and it shouldn't be restricted by copyrights. Now, whatever your view, rights holders of all kinds of works are suing AI companies for training on their data. The number of cases is rising significantly. Here are a few examples. First of all, Getty Images have sued Stability AI in the UK and the US for allegedly training Stable Diffusion on Getty's images without permission. Perhaps the highest profile case of all is New York Times, which has sued Microsoft and OpenAI for training its GPT models on their news articles. And quite recently, a collective of major record labels, including Warner, Sony, Universal, have sued two AI startups, Udio and Suno, in the US for training models on their artists' works, including, as you can see here, ABBA. I happen to think that even listening to ABBA should be illegal, but that's beside the point. And the arguments in these cases are they're pretty interesting, actually, from a legal and technical point of view. In the US cases, they tend to center around this concept of fair use. And that's a doctrine which allows the use of copyright works for certain purposes. There's a US Supreme Court case involving the Andy Warhol Foundation, and that sets out factors as to what does and doesn't constitute fair use. And it looks at things like how much of the work is taken, whether the use is transformative, what impact it might have on the market value of the original. And it's currently unclear whether training generative AI falls under fair use in all cases, some cases, or no cases. So in the UK, in the US, we've got fair use. But the other thing about copyright law is that it's jurisdictional. While it is partially harmonized by an agreement from 1886 called the Berne Convention, there is some variation between different countries, particularly around exceptions to copyright infringements. For example, in the UK, we have narrowly defined exceptions, and it's been kind of interesting to see how defendants like Stability AI have argued that these exceptions apply. In the EU, there's a specific exception that allows text and data mining. Now, this exception predates the rise of generative AI, but the forthcoming AI Act strongly implies that the exception does indeed apply to training AI models. In Japan, there's also a text and data mining exception, but whereas in the EU, there has to be an opt-out. So you have to provide a means for rights holders to opt out of this exception, whereas in Japan, there is no such opt-out. So it's kind of led to Japan being referred to as the paradise for training generative AI models. So I guess one question is, should everyone just move their servers to Japan or to another country where they have permissive copyright laws, or maybe just out to international waters and do their training there? Not so fast, because some of these laws actually have extraterritorial reach. In particular, the EU's AI Act makes clear that any model brought into service in the EU or put on the market in the EU must respect opt-outs, irrespective of where the training has taken place. So if someone ignores these opt-outs, then they may not only be infringing copyright, but they may also be infringing the AI Act, for which there are some really juicy penalties on offer, as you may have heard. The idea is that nobody should be able to gain a competitive advantage by going somewhere with more permissive laws than the EU and then bring the resulting model into the EU. And the UK has a similar doctrine. Now, the AI Act also requires providers of generative AI models, general purpose models, to provide a summary of training data that's used to train the models, making it easier for right holders to assert their rights against those companies. Another question here, an interesting one, is what constitutes a valid and effective opt-out? under the EU's text and data mining exception. I mean, it should be machine readable, but does that just mean a plain text statement on a website just saying, do not use this for training AI models? I mean, computers can read that. OpenAI have attempted to deal with this opt-out by creating something called the Media Manager, where people can register works to be opted out. But it's kind of slightly against how copyright usually works. It puts quite a high burden on rights holders having to register everything. And particularly if every AI company demands the same thing, you don't want to have to register every single copyright work with OpenAI and with Google and with Meta and everyone else. So that might not be the ideal solution either. Others have pointed to the robots exclusion protocol. So there's the robots.txt file, which sits at the root directory of a web page, and that can be used to ask crawlers and bots not to do certain things. There are a few kind of issues with that. First of all, it requires control over the web server and the website. So individuals can't necessarily opt out specific works as they might like to. Secondly, you can block individual web crawlers like, say, OpenAI's or Google's, but clearly blocking every individual company's crawler separately is not a very practical answer, particularly as you'll probably only be aware of it happening when it's too late. The trailing scraping's probably already happened. And it again puts a lot of burden on the rights holder. So alternatively, you could say no to all AI bots. Your robots exclusion protocol could say no scraping at all, but that might prevent you from getting indexed by Google, which has other far-reaching implications. So I think we kind of need a robust standard recognized by a legal body like the European Commission, but that doesn't exist yet. It probably needs to be a combination of web page level exclusion protocol and also file level metadata, but it's a kind of a watch this space at the moment. So in summary, the answer to that one is that we don't yet know the extent to which training AI models on copyright works is legal. I won't offer a strong view here myself, except to say that generative AI kind of, in its current form at least, it lives or dies on human creative input. There are some people think that you can train AIs on synthetic data, and while that may have some function, for example, training a small model based on a large model's data, if you continue to use synthetic data, it will probably lead to model collapse eventually, without the continued injection of human creativity. That kind of seems obvious to me, sampling from a distribution and then using it as data to learn more about the distribution, but not everyone agrees with that. So human creativity is probably needed, and for that reason, there needs to be incentives for that human creativity and incentives to publish creative works. So somehow I think we need to get to a place where AI companies license the data they use for AI training. There are some great initiatives out there, like the Dataset Providers Alliance, working on how that might work in practice. Sam Altman says that it's impossible to get licenses for internet scale datasets, but in fact, OpenAI and the other big players are already striking license deals with publishers to try to hold off lawsuits, essentially. And I also think the direction of travel for frontier AI will be to do more with less data and higher quality data. So we'll see how that goes. Okay, so we've talked a bit about inputs, training. I'm now going to move on to outputs. So let's say you work for a marketing department of a company and you decide to use Midjourney or ChatGPT or some other AI model in an advertising campaign. And a competitor decides they like what you've done and they just rip it off completely. I mean, if they've removed any association with your brand, trademark law won't help you. And ordinarily, you'd be able to fall back on copyright. But like I said at the start, IP rights are historically for works of human intellect. And the question is, do AI creations attract copyright protection at all? And if they do, who owns it? This is another place where the answer is jurisdiction specific. There's a famous case in the US called Théâtre de Doppler Spécial. And I apologize to any French speakers on this call for absolutely murdering that pronunciation. Here's the image. that was generated by AI. It's quite a striking picture, and it won an art competition. And it resulted from over 600 prompts into, I think, Midjourney. But the US court said that this wasn't enough to confer sufficient level of originality for copyright to subsist. Many other jurisdictions seem to be taking similar approaches. And as an aside, courts around the world, including the UK and the US, have widely refused to provide patent protection for inventions created solely by AI. But the UK is a bit of a weird outlier when it comes to copyright. Here in the UK, copyright-generated works do get copyright protection. Sorry, computer-generated works do get copyright protection. And the question is then who owns the output? And under UK law, it's the person, I'm going to read this out, by whom the arrangements necessary for the creation of the work are undertaken. So who is that? Is it the company that trained the model, or is it the user who did the prompting? Maybe it depends on how much prompting happened. You know, was it a complex endeavor like this Théâtre d'Opera spatial image, or was it just a random seed passed into an image generator? We don't know at the moment. Either way, you can imagine some slightly weird outcomes. You know, one situation is where a work could be protected by copyright in the UK, but not in the US and elsewhere in the world. And all of this stems from the fact that copyright was harmonized back in 1886, as I said. And back then, modern AI systems weren't really anticipated. What we really need is a new treaty that recognizes the realities of AI technology and attempts to harmonize IP around that. But that requires a lot of international cooperation, which is not necessarily the easiest thing to achieve in the modern world. Okay, so far we've been talking mostly about data. So I'm now going to move on to talking a bit about algorithms. You know, the meat grinders that chew up all the lovely data to create models and hopefully do something useful with them. And I'm going to talk about how IP rights and IP strategy apply to these algorithms and models. So say you're an innovative company going about your business, you've got a product or service, uses generative AI. Maybe you trained or fine-tuned the model, maybe you didn't, but either way, you've invested a lot in your product or service, and you want to convert that investment into profit or growth or some kind of competitive advantage. An IP strategy question you might ask yourself is, what combination of IP rights can help you achieve that? Now, in a lot of other technical fields, this is kind of simple. If you create an innovative new food mixer, you can't keep it secret. Not if you want to sell any. You can't open source your food mixer. So you probably decide to patent it. But things are a lot more nuanced when your creation is a computer implemented invention or indeed an AI model. So to help me illustrate some of the issues, I'm gonna tell a story. This one's about Meta. There is their CEO on the 4th of July. It's actually not a deep fake. That is Mark Zuckerberg living his best life on a hydrofoil in a tuxedo. Now, like any self-respecting big tech company, Meta had been working on large language models for several years before ChatGPT came out. But having been beaten to the punch by OpenAI, they decided they had to do something different. One of the things that they did differently is that they released the source code for their large language model, Llama, under a copyleft open source license. Copyleft means that any modifications to the code had to be released under the same open source license, which was GPL3 for anyone who's interested. But what that meant was that organizations with sufficient resources would be able to build on Meta's architecture and infrastructure, build their own versions of Llama, and would have to publicly release the developments they made ready to be fed back into Meta's products. But what Meta didn't do was release the model weights that went with the Meta architecture. That's i.e. the parameters resulting from the multi-million-dollar scraping and training process, apart from allowing certain research institutions to use them. Now, without the weights, Llama itself couldn't be straightforwardly replicated. But a week later, March 2023, a CSV file containing all the model weights got leaked via the infamous libertarian troll website 4chan. So what did that mean from an IP perspective? Well, while the model weights were undercover, they were a trade secret. Had one of Meta's engineers walked off to OpenAI or Google at that point with the CSV file, Meta would have had legal remedies to prevent them from being used. But what about when the weights were released? What IP actually subsists in those model weights? Based on what we were talking about earlier, they almost certainly won't qualify for copyright because they're machine generated. If they were trained in Europe or the UK, they might be protectable with a database right, but that's untested. And in any case, the US doesn't have database rights like we do here. So it seems that once they're public, they really are public domain, fill your boots, use them for whatever you want. Now, Meta actually did successfully get GitHub and Hugging Face to take down repositories hosting the weights, and those companies probably didn't fancy a fight with Meta, but it's questionable legally whether they actually had to do that. So poor old Meta, they seem to have lost a key piece of IP that they'd spent a lot of money and time generating. But was it actually so bad for them? What they did next had a very big impact on the story of generative AI development going forwards. Meta kind of lent into it, they doubled down, and for their next model, Llama 2, they released the entire model, including the architecture and weights and everything, openly, as if that was always the plan. And what they found was that having large sections of the open source community, not just very well-funded organizations, building upon their foundation models was massively beneficial to them. People were suddenly creating and releasing inventions and optimizations within Meta's framework that Meta could happily pick up and choose from. Another key point here is that Meta didn't actually release Llama 2 under a true open source license. Instead, they created a custom copyright license, which resembles an open source license, but it freezes out companies of a certain size, in other words, Meta's competitors, and also prevents use of Llama 2 to train other AI models. And by the time they got to Llama 3 earlier this year, they were even bolder with the license and added the provision that the name of any model based on Llama 3 would have to start with Llama 3, and that any product or service that uses it must prominently display built with Meta Llama 3. So now they're kind of leveraging IP to do their marketing for them. Also, don't be fooled, Meta has a lot of AI-related patents, and they found creative ways to benefit from them, even whilst maintaining this kind of open-armed, I probably shouldn't use the word facade, but, image. For example, Meta transferred a number of core AI patents to non-competing entities, but which were strategically useful to Meta, such as Midjourney, which a lot of their images were being published on social media and helping Meta out. That was ostensibly to help Midjourney protect itself from non-practicing entities, but it also kind of harmed the relationship between Meta and Midjourney. Meta continues to file large numbers of patents on business-critical aspects of its AI technology, in particular, anything relevant to their kind of main business of selling adverts. Just talk about a couple of other companies. In contrast with Meta, since releasing ChatGPT, OpenAI have kept details of their flagship models closed, including model weights and architectures and everything else. OpenAI's patents have now started to publish, and as you might expect, they focus on core AI algorithms. And that makes total sense from a business perspective, because their business is selling subscriptions to AI systems. Google, on the other hand, has a mix of open models and closed models and a very wide AI-related patent portfolio, and that kind of reflects the fact that it has its fingers in a lot of pies, from search to workspace apps to cloud services and all the rest. And Google actually have a granted US patent to the transformer architecture as described in the paper, Attention is All You Need. Sadly for them, it only covers the encoder-decoder architecture, whereas most LLMs are actually built on decoder-only architectures and are not covered. So that's a bit of an unfortunate miss by Google. But there are many other examples. One of my kind of favorite, more recent ones is an application they filed for leveraging a user's mobile phones to hoover up radio broadcasts and use that to train generative AI voice models. You can imagine that might create IP infringement issues of its own. And probably a nice example, actually, of how having a patent for something doesn't necessarily mean you won't be infringing someone else's IP. Now, not everyone is Meta or OpenAI or Google, but these examples demonstrate this common principle, which is that companies often use IP to protect their main revenue streams, including patents, trade secrets. But there's a lot of flexibility on how you deploy these rights, and quite a lot of scope for getting creative outside of that. You might want to run open source projects to accelerate development, pool resources with other companies, attract great talent, win kudos. You might use patents to signal to the market that you can do something no one else can to get investment. You might want to license your technology. You might want to publish research to prevent others from patenting ideas. Wherever you sit in the AI value chain, you kind of need to ask yourself, how do you want to make money from the technology? What possible threats are there from other parties, and how can IP be best used to mitigate those risks, and potentially providing other benefits at the same time? So to make well-informed decisions, you kind of need people who understand the commercial, technical, and the legal aspects of it. Right, the last thing I'd like to get off my chest is about the application of the term open source to AI. Now, you'll hear a lot of companies talking about open sourcing AI models, including Meta, that I was just talking about earlier. But what is open source? Well, it's a method of sharing software in which source code is released under an open source license, which enables anyone to copy, modify, distribute, and use the code for any purpose. But what about an AI system? An AI system is not a traditional software system, but it's actually a collection of artifacts or objects. It includes models, source code, arguably data too. So what actually constitutes an open source AI system? Now, the Open Source Initiative, who are the stewards of the open source definition, has been working on a definition that attempts to put open source AI on the same functional footing as open source software. That means to enable, it needs to enable users to use, study, modify, and share the system with others for any purpose and without asking for permission. So as part of that, the source code should be released under an open source license. The model weights should also be provided. It's questionable whether a license is needed for those, for the reasons I've talked about. And in the latest draft, the OSI have also indicated, rightly in my opinion, that information on the training data should also be made available. This one's rather more controversial. But the question is, even then, is that enough? An open source license is effectively a copyright license, but it also implicitly or explicitly licenses any patents covered by the code. And the idea there is that the rights holder gives downstream users all the rights they need to use the software without fear of infringing upstream parties' IP. But in the case of generative AI models, the model provider typically does not and cannot license the data used to train the models. So what if the downstream user uses an AI system and it outputs something that infringes copyright? You can see there's a potential problem here because, and some have argued that the definition of open source AI should require the open licensing of training data to give downstream parties the true freedoms that open source is supposed to provide. Okay, so I'm going to finish off by posing a question that draws together a few of these topics, and that's around AI-generated code. So it's estimated that about 50% of code is now generated by AI, and that's expected to rise. And based on what we've just talked about, it may be that copyright doesn't apply to that AI-generated code. Well, the whole framework on which code is shared, whether proprietary or open source, is based on the notion that copyright applies to code and has done since the 1980s. So what happens when that's no longer the case? Do we return to the situation where there is no applicable IP right? That might have been okay in the days when most code was kind of tied to a piece of hardware. But in the modern world of online code repositories, what means are there for controlling who uses software and how? And that's an open question that I'd like to end with.